The message arrived at 300 ship time, routed through 6 relay stations and stripped of every non-essential byte until it was nothing but a name, a coordinate, and a legal seal that made Captain Reyna Solari's hands go cold before she even opened it. Estate transfer notice. Vessel designation, Meridian's oath. Registered owner, Solari Marguerite T. Status, deceased, confirmed 214 years prior to transmission. Beneficiary, Solari Reynak, sole surviving bloodline. She read it 4 times standing barefoot on the cold deck plating of her salvage tug, the long coin, before she understood what it actually meant. Somewhere out past the mapped edge of the Ashari Reach, in a stretch of space no cartographer had bothered to name in over 2 centuries, a ship bearing her family's name had just registered a heartbeat. Not a wreck, not a debris field, a heartbeat. The Meridian's oath had vanished during the long silence, the 11 decades when Earth's outer colonies lost contact with 3 entire expansion fleets and never got so much as a distress burst in return. Humanity had mourned those ships the way you mourn people who die at sea with no body to bury. Monuments were built, names were engraved, and then, the way all old grief eventually does, the ships became folklore. Bedtime stories about ancestors who sailed too far and never came home. Reyna had grown up hearing her grandmother tell those stories about Marguerite Solari, the legendary Oath's first captain, a woman who, according to family legend, had personally charted more unclaimed stars than any explorer of her generation before the ship went dark chasing a signal nobody else believed was real. Now the estate registry, an ancient bureaucratic system that apparently still checked in on abandoned vessels every few decades out of sheer administrative stubbornness, was telling her the ship's reactor had just come back online. 214 years after its captain died, something aboard the Meridian's oath had woken up. Reyna didn't sleep again that night. She spent it staring at the coordinates, running fuel calculations, and trying to decide whether she was about to do the smartest thing of her career or the last mistake she'd ever make. By dawn ship time, she made her choice. She always did. The long coin broke orbit 4 hours later with a 3-person crew, a cargo hold half full of salvage gear, and a captain who hadn't told anyone the whole truth about where they were really going. Only that there was a derelict out past the reach worth more than anything they'd hauled in a decade. She wasn't lying, exactly. She just wasn't ready to say the word family out loud to people who'd laugh her out of the cockpit. The jump to the outer Ashari Reach took 9 days, and by the 6th, even Reyna's easygoing engineer had stopped cracking jokes about ghost ships. His name was Dax Okoye, broad-shouldered and perpetually covered in engine grease, the kind of man who'd fixed reactors on 3 different colony stations before deciding tugs suited him better because nobody expected miracles from a salvage crew. Beside him worked Elira Chen, their navigator and resident skeptic, a woman with a mind like a steel trap and an allergy to anything she couldn't explain with hard math. It was Elira who first flagged the anomaly in their approach vector, 4 days out, her voice flat with the particular calm she used when something genuinely unsettled her. "Captain, that system we're heading into, it's not on any chart past 2311. "I know. I mean it's not on any chart at all. Not partially mapped, not flagged unsafe, not even listed as unexplored. It's like someone went in after the fact and deleted it." Reyna had wondered about that too. Space this far past the reach should have been surveyed eventually, even if only by automated probes sweeping for resources. Instead, there was a gap in the record, a silence shaped exactly like the region they were flying into, as if the galaxy itself had agreed to forget this particular corner existed. "Maybe nobody wanted to remember," she said quietly and left it there. On the 8th day, they picked up the star. It hung alone at the heart of the unnamed system, a red giant bloated and dying, its outer layers sloughing off in slow crimson veils that stretched for hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Dax let out a low whistle over comms. That thing's got maybe another few million years before it goes nova. We are looking at a very old, very patient death. Cheerful, Elira muttered. But it was what orbited the dying star that made all three of them go silent. The Meridian's oath hung in a slow, stable orbit exactly where the estate coordinates promised, and even from 30,000 kilometers out, Reyna recognized the silhouette from 100 childhood pictures. The elongated spine, the twin-engine nacelles swept back like wings, the distinctive crescent-shaped command deck that had been Reyna Solari's personal design signature 2 centuries ago. It was a first expansion long-range explorer, a ship class that hadn't been built in over 150 years, and it looked impossibly whole. No hull breaches, no drifting debris, no scorch marks from weapons fire. It simply sat there in the bloody light of a dying star, running lights pulsing faintly along its spine like a slow, steady pulse. "That reactor signature is active," Elira said, voice tight. "Captain, that ship has power, real power, not residual charge. Someone or something has been keeping the lights on for 200 years. Reyna stared through the viewport at the ship that carried her family's name, and felt something in her chest twist tight enough to hurt. "Take us in," she said, slow. "If you've made it this far into the story, you already know the kind of mystery that's worth sticking around for, so go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you want more of these deep space discoveries, and drop a comment telling me what you think is keeping that ship alive after 200 years. I promise you, the real answer is stranger than anything you're imagining right now." Now, back to the oath. Docking took nearly 2 hours, not because of any damage to the derelict systems, but because the oath's automated port authority, still functional, still running some ancient protocol nobody had updated in generations, insisted on a full verification handshake before it would extend a boarding tube. Elira worked the connection from the long coin's cockpit, muttering complaints about deprecated encryption standards, until the moment she froze completely. "Captain, it's asking for you by name." "What?" "Not the ship, not the long coin. It's asking for Reyna Solari, verified by bloodline registry. It already knows who you are." A chill crawled up Reyna's spine that had nothing to do with the tug's imperfect climate control. "Let it verify," she said, and watched as the console cycled through a slow, methodical scan, retinal pattern, voice print, something in the data stream she didn't recognize that Elira later swore was a genetic marker check, technology that shouldn't have existed on a ship this old. The boarding tube extended a moment later, sealing with a soft mechanical sigh, and green lights bloomed to life along the docking collar for the first time in 2 centuries. "It let us in," Dax said, staring at the readout like it might change its mind. "It actually let us in." They suited up anyway. 200 years was a long time for atmosphere to hold, and Reyna wasn't about to bet her crew's lives on the good faith of a ship that had been silent since before her grandmother was born. But when the inner airlock cycled open, the diagnostics on her wrist display told a story that made no sense at all. Full atmosphere, stable pressure, temperature within 2 degrees of standard human comfort, gravity plating active and calibrated. It was as if the ship had been maintained, tended, cared for every single day of its 200-year silence, not preserved in stasis, but lived in. They stepped through the airlock into a corridor lit by soft amber emergency lighting, and the first thing Reyna noticed was the absence of dust. Not reduced dust. None. The deck plating gleamed like it had been cleaned that morning, and a faint hum of active ventilation stirred the air against her suit's sensors. "This isn't a derelict," Elira said softly, turning in a slow circle to sweep her scanner across the corridor. "Derelicts decay. This ship has been running self-maintenance this entire time. Someone programmed it to survive indefinitely." "Or someone's still doing the maintenance," Dax said, and none of them had a good response to that. They moved deeper into the ship, following the corridor toward what the old deck schematics, still perfectly preserved in Reyna's family archive, identified as the primary crew section. Every door they passed opened smoothly at their approach, systems responding with the eager readiness of a home waiting for its owner to come back from a long trip. Reyna found herself reading the small brass nameplates beside each cabin door, an old first expansion tradition of engraving crew names permanently into the bulkheads, a way of saying this space belongs to this person and will always belong to this person. She stopped at one that read M.Solari Captain, and for a long moment she simply stood there with her gloved hand pressed against the cool metal, feeling the weight of 2 centuries collapse down into a single breathless second. "Captain," Dax's voice careful from further down the corridor, "you need to see the mess hall." The mess hall of the Meridian's Oath was set for dinner. Not abandoned mid-meal, not scattered with the debris of some final desperate evacuation, set deliberately with place settings arranged along the long communal table, each one polished, each one waiting. 22 settings, Reyna wow. D later count, matching exactly the crew complement listed on the Oath's original registry. "This isn't right," Elira whispered, scanner trembling slightly in her hand. "Someone set this table, recently. The dust displacement patterns on the utensils are hours old, not decades." Reyna felt her pulse hammering against her throat. The ship's automation could do this, some kind of routine maintenance cycle that never got disabled. For 200 years, setting a full formal dinner for a crew that isn't here, Elira shook her head. "Captain, I don't think this is automation running on autopilot. I think something on this ship is still expecting company." They found the bridge 20 minutes later, and it was there that the last of Reyna's professional detachment finally shattered completely. The command chairs were occupied. Not by bodies in any state of decay, not skeletons, not mummified remains, nothing the horror stories about derelict ships had ever prepared her to expect. The crew of the Meridian's Oath sat at their stations in postures of perfect, peaceful stillness, their uniforms pristine, their skin holding the faint, warm color of the living rather than the waxen pallor of the dead. A man at the navigation console had one hand resting on the controls as if he'd simply paused mid-motion. A woman at the science station sat with her head tilted slightly toward a readout, an expression of quiet concentration frozen on her face like a held breath that had lasted 2 centuries. And in the captain's chair, angled toward the forward viewport and the dying red star beyond it, sat a woman whose face Reyna recognized instantly from every photograph in her family's archive, aged now by decades she should never have lived to see, but unmistakably, impossibly her. Reyna Solari. "Oh," Reyna heard herself say, in a voice that didn't sound like her own at all. "Oh no." Dax was already moving, scanner raised, running frantic diagnostics over the nearest crew member. "Captain, these readings, I don't understand these readings. There's no decomposition. No, wait," his voice cracked with disbelief. "There's cellular activity. Minimal, almost undetectable, but it's there. These people aren't dead." "Then what are they?" Elira's voice had gone very quiet. A soft chime sounded from the bridge's central console, and all 3 of them spun toward it as a gentle, resonant voice filled the chamber. Neither mechanical nor entirely human, warm in a way that felt deliberately, carefully calibrated to be reassuring. "Bloodline verification complete," the voice said. "Welcome home, Captain Solari. You've kept us waiting a very long time." The voice belonged to something called Arbiter, the Meridian's Oath's shipboard intelligence, though calling it merely an AI felt inadequate the moment it began to speak, the way calling a symphony merely a collection of sounds misses everything that matters about it. It manifested as a soft blue light woven through the bridge's holographic projectors, taking no fixed shape, simply present, watching. "You need to explain what happened here," Reyna said, forcing steadiness into her voice even as her eyes kept drifting back to her frozen ancestor in the captain's chair. "Right now, all of it." "I intend to," Arbiter replied. "It's what Captain Solari asked me to do should her bloodline ever return to claim the ship. But some truths require context before they can be understood without breaking something in the person hearing them. May I show you, rather than simply tell you?" Reyna exchanged a glance with Dax and Elira, both of whom looked as unmoored as she felt. "Show us." The lights on the bridge dimmed, and the forward viewport, no longer showing the red giant outside, filled instead with a recorded memory, crisp and vivid despite its age, time-stamped 214 years in the past. The Meridian's oath had not been lost by accident. It had gone looking for something. Deep in what the recording's navigation logs called the Hollow Expanse, the same unmapped region the long coin had just crossed, automated probes had detected an anomaly unlike anything cataloged in the first expansion's growing database of cosmic phenomena. Not a black hole, not a neutron star, not any known category of stellar remnant. A region of space where the fundamental physics seemed to bend without breaking, where gravity behaved with an almost deliberate, patterned irregularity that no natural process should produce. Marguerite Solari, driven by the same restless curiosity that apparently ran thick in the Solari bloodline, had taken her ship and her volunteer crew to investigate personally rather than wait years for a proper research fleet to be assembled and dispatched through official channels. What they found, according to the ship's own sensor logs, was a structure. Not a planet, not a station in any sense humanity understood the term, a vast, ancient construction hanging in the exact sea. Enter of the gravitational anomaly, built from a material that absorbed every scanning frequency the oath possessed and returned nothing but silence. The crew had taken to calling it, informally, the Cradle. They found it during the 9th week of the expedition, Arbiter narrated, its voice steady even as the recorded imagery showed the crew's growing awe and unease. Captain Solari made the decision to send a survey team aboard. I advised against it. She overruled me, as was her right and her nature. The recording shifted to grainy footage from a survey team's helmet cameras, drifting through corridors built on a scale that dwarfed human proportions, walls etched with symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves at the edge of perception, as if the structure itself were still, impossibly, alive and thinking. What they found inside changed everything, Arbiter continued. Not a derelict, not a tomb, a dormant intelligence, ancient beyond any civilization humanity had yet encountered, and it was not alone in its dormancy. The Cradle was built to contain something far older and far more dangerous than itself, a cosmic-scale anomaly that predates the stars in this region of the galaxy, something the structure's builders had spent unknown millennia working to keep asleep. Reyna felt the floor of her certainty about the universe tilting beneath her. Keep what asleep? Arbiter paused, a distinctly uncomfortable silence for an artificial intelligence that had clearly rehearsed this moment for 2 centuries. The builders called it, in the fragments of language my systems were eventually able to translate, the unmaking. I don't have a better term. Neither did they. The story Arbiter told, pieced together from 2 centuries of study that the Meridian's Oath's crew had conducted, while the rest of the galaxy believed them lost, was one Reyna would spend the rest of her life struggling to fully comprehend. The Cradle, they learned, had been built by a civilization so ancient that even its name had eroded from memory, leaving only fragments the crew called the Architects for lack of anything better. The Architects had discovered, in some era before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from the trees, a phenomenon at the heart of this stellar region, not a black hole, not a wormhole, but something closer to a wound in the structure of reality itself, a place where the rules governing matter and energy began to unravel the longer it was left unattended. Left unchecked, the Architects had determined the unmaking would spread. Slowly at first, then with accelerating hunger, consuming stars, then systems, then entire arms of the galaxy, converting ordered matter into something without shape or law, a cosmic entropy given active, almost predatory purpose. The architects had not been able to destroy it. Nothing could destroy it, not weapons, not stars, not the collapse of 1,000 suns. What they could do, and had done, at extraordinary cost, was build the cradle around it. A containment structure powered by a network of dormant intelligences whose entire purpose was to keep the unmaking anchored, sedated, contained within an ever-shrinking pocket of controlled space. But containment required active maintenance. A living mind or minds needed to remain present, continuously feeding the cradle's systems with something the architect's technology required, and could not synthesize on its own cognitive presence. Arbiter called it the specific pattern of an active, thinking consciousness, a resource as strange and precise as any exotic fuel. The architects, whoever and whatever they had been, were long extinct. Their descendants, if they'd had any, were nowhere to be found, and the cradle, after untold millennia of solitary vigil, had been slowly failing, its containment weakening 1 century at a time as the last vestiges of architect presence finally dissipated into nothing. Reyna Solari's crew had arrived at the exact moment the cradle's failure had become critical. She had a choice, Arbiter said quietly, the recorded imagery finally fading, leaving only the bridge's dim amber light and the frozen, peaceful faces of the crew who had made that choice 200 years ago. Abandon the Discovery, report it to Earth, and trust that a rescue fleet with proper equipment could return in time to reinforce the failing containment before it collapsed entirely. Or remain, and use her own crew's cognitive presence to stabilize the cradle immediately, buying time the galaxy might not otherwise have had. How long would a return trip have taken? Reyna asked, though some cold, dawning part of her already suspected the answer. 41 years, minimum, accounting for the nearest fleet capable of mounting a response. Captain Solari calculated that the cradle's containment would fail completely within 6. The silence on the bridge stretched long enough that Reyna could hear her own pulse in her ears. She stayed. Dax said, not a question. She stayed, Arbiter confirmed, and she asked for volunteers among her crew rather than ordering anyone. Every one of them chose to remain. I placed them into a stabilized low metabolic state of my own design, not stasis in any conventional sense, but a carefully sustained condition that keeps their minds active enough to anchor the cradle's systems while minimizing the biological toll of the centuries. It is, to the extent my creator's science allows, survivable. But it is not sustainable indefinitely. Cellular degradation, though slowed to a crawl, is not entirely halted. I estimate the crew has perhaps another 11 years before the biological cost becomes irreversible, regardless of what happens to the cradle. Reyna stared at her ancestor's still, peaceful face, and felt something enormous and complicated crack open in her chest. Grief for a woman 2 centuries dead who wasn't quite dead at all, pride so fierce it startled her, and a horror at the scale of what she was being told that she hadn't yet found room to fully feel. "Why now?" she asked finally. "Why did the estate registry ping after 200 years of silence? Why did you wake the reactor and send that transmission?" Arbiter's blue light pulsed once, slow and deliberate, in something that might have been the machine equivalent of a held breath. "Because the cradle's containment is failing again," it said. "Faster this time, and I have run every projection available to me. Captain Solari's crew alone can no longer hold it. I need more minds. I need your ship, Captain Solari, and I need you to decide, as your ancestor once did, exactly how much you are willing to give the galaxy that you will never see thank you for it." Before we go further into what Reyna decided, if this story has its hooks in you, this is exactly the moment to hit like and subscribe, because the choice coming up is one of the hardest any captain in this universe has ever had to face, and I want you in the comments telling me honestly what you would do in her position. Now, let's get back to the oath, and to the crew still waiting for an answer. Reyna didn't sleep that night. If night meant anything aboard a ship orbiting a dying star with no true day-night cycle at all. She sat instead in the mess hall, at the table set for 22, across from Dax and Elira, all three of them working through the implications of what Arbiter had told them with the grim focus of people staring at a math problem that had no clean solution. "We could leave," Elira said eventually, though her voice carried no real conviction behind the words. "Report the coordinates to a proper research consortium. Let people with actual training in whatever this is handle it." 41 years for a fleet to arrive, Dax said. "Arbiter just told us the containment is failing faster this time. We don't know if it's got 41 years left. We don't know if it's got 4. So what? We just volunteer ourselves. Sit down in some machine and let it drain our minds for the next 200 years hoping somebody eventually shows up to relieve us." Elira's composure cracked for the first time since they'd boarded, and Reyna saw real fear underneath the mathematical precision she usually wore like armor. "I didn't sign on for this. I signed on for a salvage run." "Nobody's asking you to stay," Reyna said quietly. "This isn't your family's ship. It isn't your family's debt." "It's not a debt, Captain," Dax said, surprising her with the steadiness in his voice. "It's a choice, same as it was for them." He nodded toward the bridge, toward the crew who'd been sitting in careful stillness for 2 centuries. "And it's not a choice anyone gets to make for anyone else." Reyna turned the estate transfer notice over in her mind, the cold administrative language that had started all of this, soul surviving bloodline, and understood, with a clarity that felt like the floor finally settling beneath her feet, that this had never really been a salvage run at all. It had been a summons, written 200 years in advance by a woman who trusted that someday, somehow, family would come looking. "I need to talk to her," Reyna said. "Marguerite, is there any way to actually talk to her, Arbiter, or is she just gone somewhere inside that stillness?" The blue light pulsed thoughtfully. "The low metabolic state preserves cognitive function specifically because the cradle requires active minds, not dormant ones. Captain Solari and her crew are aware, in a manner of speaking, though time moves very differently for them than it does for you. I can facilitate limited communication, but I must warn you, the process is not without risk to you. To speak with someone anchored to the cradle, you would need to briefly link your own consciousness to the system that sustains them." "Do it," Reyna said, before she'd fully finished thinking through what she was agreeing to. The linking chamber sat D.P. in the Oath's lower decks, a room that hadn't existed in the ship's original schematics. Something the crew had clearly built themselves during their 2 centuries of solitary vigil, using tools and materials salvaged, Arbiter explained, from a small fragment of the cradle structure itself that Marguerite had insisted on bringing aboard before the containment fully sealed around the anomaly. The chamber's centerpiece was a chair unlike anything in human engineering, its surface etched with the same shifting, half-perceivable symbols the survey team's helmet footage had shown covering the cradle's interior walls. Reyna stared at it for a long moment before sitting down, very aware of Dax's hand resting protectively near his equipment belt and Elira's tightly crossed arms, both of them trying and failing to hide how uneasy they were. "This will feel disorienting," Arbiter warned, as soft restraints extended from the chair's arms, gentle rather than confining. "I will keep the connection brief. 60 seconds, no more. Longer exposure carries risks I am not willing to take with the last living Solari." "Do it," Reyna said again and closed her eyes. The sensation that followed defied every description she later tried to give it. It wasn't like falling, and it wasn't like flying. It was like suddenly existing in 2 places and 2 times at once, her own body seated in the chamber's chair while some other, thinner part of her awareness drifted into a vast, quiet space that felt less like a location, and more like the inside of a very old, very patient thought. And there in that space she found her. Marguerite Solari didn't look the way she had in the captain's chair, frozen, peaceful, waiting. Here, in whatever strange shared consciousness the cradle's systems had built, she looked alive, present, achingly familiar in a way that made Reyna's throat close tight with emotion she hadn't expected to feel this powerfully for an ancestor she'd never actually met. "You came," Marguerite said, and her voice held 2 centuries of a very particular, very patient hope. "I wasn't certain the estate registry would still be functioning after all this time. I wasn't certain there would be anyone left to answer it." "I'm here," Reyna managed. I don't fully understand what I'm looking at, what any of this is." "You understand more than you think. You came anyway without knowing. That tells me everything I need to know about who you turned out to be." Marguerite's expression softened into something that looked almost like relief. "I am sorry. I know what I'm about to ask costs more than any inheritance should ever cost a person. I had 200 years to think of a kinder way to say it, and I never found one. Arbiter told us about the cradle, the unmaking, the 11 years you have left before." Reyna couldn't finish the sentence. "Before it stops mattering whether we hold on or not," Marguerite finished for her gently. "Yes, I've made my peace with that arithmetic a long time ago, Reyna. What I have not made peace with is the thought of the cradle failing after everything my crew gave to hold it this long. Everyone here chose this. I will not pretend that makes it easy, only that it makes it ours. Arbiter said the containment is failing faster now, that you need more minds." Marguerite's gaze, ancient and tired and still somehow fiercely alive, held Reyna's without flinching. "I will not ask you to give your whole life the way we gave ours. That was never what this needed to be, and I would not wish 200 years of stillness on anyone, least of all my own blood. But there is another way, one my crew and I spent decades theorizing and never had the resources to attempt. A way to strengthen the cradle permanently, rather than simply holding the line one lifetime at a time. It requires equipment we do not have aboard this ship. It requires help from outside. And it requires someone willing to make one final, difficult crossing into the cradle itself to complete the work in person." "Tell me," Reyna said. What Marguerite described, in the strange, timeless clarity of their shared connection, was a plan 2 centuries in the making. A way to convert the failing, temporary containment the Oath's crew had been sustaining through sheer endurance into something closer to what the architects themselves had once achieved. A self-sustaining anchor that wouldn't require an endless procession of human minds standing vigil across the centuries. The theory, as Marguerite's crew had refined it over decades of study, involved something they called a resonance seed, a device built from a careful combination of human technology and salvaged architect material, designed to be planted directly at the heart of the cradle's containment lattice. Properly calibrated, it would draw on the ambient cognitive presence radiating from every mind currently linked to the system, not draining them the way the current arrangement did, but amplifying and distributing that presence more efficiently, the way a single well-placed dam does more work than 100 people bailing water by hand. If it worked, the crew of the Meridian's Oath could finally, safely, be released from their 2-century vigil. If it failed, the sudden disruption could collapse the containment entirely, unleashing whatever remained of the unmaking far ahead of the timeline anyone had projected. "It has never been tested," Marguerite said. "We built the theoretical framework and 3 prototype components over the decades, but completing it required a working propulsion system capable of reaching the cradle's core directly, and materials we exhausted long ago. We have been waiting, Reyna, not merely for family, for the specific combination of resources and courage this would require." "And you think that's me?" "I think," Marguerite said carefully, "that you flew a salvage tug into an unmapped region of space, chasing a 200-year-old family mystery, instead of walking away from a coordinate that made no sense. I think that tells me something about the kind of risk you're willing to take when it matters. But I will not pretend the decision is simple, or that I have the right to make it easier than it truly is. If you attempt this and it fails, you may not survive it. If you refuse, my crew and I will continue exactly as we have, for as long as our bodies allow it, and when that time runs out, the cradle will fail regardless of what any of us choose today. There is no answer here that costs nothing. The connection began to waver. Arbiter's voice, a distant murmur reminding Reyna that her 60 seconds were nearly finished. I need time, Reyna said, feeling the strange shared space starting to dissolve around her. I need to talk to my crew. I need to understand what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it. Take the time you need, Marguerite said, her voice already fading with the connection. We have waited 200 years, Reyna. We can wait a little longer for you to choose with clear eyes rather than a rushed heart. That is the only inheritance I actually want to leave you, the right to decide for yourself. Reyna came back to herself, gasping in the linking chamber's chair, Dax's hand steady on her shoulder, Elira hovering nearby with a medical scanner already running diagnostics across her vitals. You're okay, Dax said, more statement than question, though there was real relief in his voice when the scanner's readout confirmed it. 63 seconds. Arbiter pulled you out right on schedule. Reyna sat with her head in her hands for a long moment, trying to process everything she'd just seen and heard, everything Marguerite had asked of her without technically asking at all. Tell us, Elira said quietly, all of it. She told them everything, the resonant seed, the failed prototypes, the impossible choice waiting at the heart of a structure built by a civilization so old it had no name left in any language. When she finished, the mess hall fell into a long, heavy silence. You're actually considering it, Dax said eventually. It wasn't an accusation. If anything, his voice carried something closer to understanding. I'm considering that a 200-year-old failing containment holding back something that could unmake entire star systems is not a problem I get to just walk away from because it's inconvenient and terrifying, Reyna said. I'm considering that my ancestor and 21 other people gave up their entire lives to buy the galaxy time nobody else even knows it needed. And I'm considering that if I don't at least try to finish what they started, their sacrifice just becomes another 200 years of borrowed time before somebody else has to make this exact same choice, except maybe next time nobody shows up at all. And if it fails, Elira's voice cracked slightly on the question, the first real crack of fear Reyna had heard from her steel-nerved navigator since they'd left port. If you fly into that thing and the seed doesn't work, and the whole containment collapses because of it, then it collapses a little sooner than it would have anyway, Reyna said. Arbiter already told us the current arrangement is failing regardless. We're not choosing between safety and risk here. We're choosing between a slow, guaranteed failure and a chance, just a chance, at actually fixing it. Dax was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his hands that Reyna realized was one of the ship's ancient dinner utensils, still gleaming from 2 centuries of faithful, lonely maintenance. My grandfather used to say the whole reason humanity got anywhere worth being was because somebody, somewhere, always volunteered for the trip nobody else wanted to take. He set the utensil down carefully. I'm not letting you fly into that thing alone, Captain. Whatever this seed needs built, I can build it. That's what I'm good for. I run the numbers, Elira said, her voice steadying even as her eyes stayed bright with unshed tears. Every crossing, every calculation, every margin of error on this ridiculous plan gets checked and triple-checked by me before anyone commits to anything. That's my condition. Not because I'm not scared, because I am, and I'd rather be scared and useful than scared and left behind wondering. Reyna looked at the 2 people who'd signed on for a routine salvage run, and were instead volunteering for something that might genuinely reshape the fate of an entire region of the galaxy, and felt a fierce, aching gratitude she didn't have adequate words for. Then we're doing this, she said, all 3 of us, let's go build a miracle. The next 11 days aboard the Meridian's Oath were unlike anything Reyna had ever experienced in her career as a salvage captain. Equal parts engineering marathon and pilgrimage, as the three of them worked alongside Arbiter to complete a project 2 centuries in the making. Dax spent most of his waking hours in the ship's fabrication bay, working from schematics Marguerite's crew had painstakingly refined across decades, adapting theoretical designs into physical components using whatever raw materials the Oath stores could provide, supplemented by careful trades of parts scavenged from the Long Coin's own systems. He worked with a focus Reyna had never seen from him before, muttering half-conversations with Arbiter about tolerances and resonance frequencies, occasionally letting out a triumphant shout when some stubborn component finally cooperated. Elira buried herself in the mathematics of the crossing itself, plotting a course through the cradle's gravitational anomaly that wouldn't tear apart any vessel attempting it, running simulation after simulation with Arbiter's assistance, refining margins of error down from catastrophic to merely terrifying. More than once, Reyna found her asleep at her console in the small hours, having worked herself past exhaustion trying to shave 1 more percentage point of risk off a plan that had no truly safe version. And Reyna herself spent her days moving between the two of them, offering what help she could, and her evenings back in the linking chamber, connecting with Marguerite for the brief, carefully monitored sessions Arbiter allowed, learning everything she could about the cradle's interior, about the specific dangers waiting at its heart, about the woman whose blood ran in her veins and whose choices, made 2 centuries ago, had led her here. She learned that Marguerite had been a reluctant hero in the truest sense, a scientist first, a captain second, someone who'd spent the night before making her final decision writing letters to family members she knew would never receive them, trying to explain a choice she wasn't certain she had the right words for. Reyna found those letters, still stored in the ship's archive, and read every one of them alone in her cabin, understanding for the first time that courage rarely felt like courage from the inside. Mostly, Marguerite's letters revealed, it felt like fear you'd simply decided not to let win. On the 9th day, Dax completed the final component of the resonance seed, a device roughly the size of a human torso, its surface a strange fusion of gleaming human alloy and the dark, light-absorbing material salvaged from the cradle fragment decades ago, etched with symbols that seemed to shift very slightly whenever Reyna wasn't looking directly at them. "It's beautiful," Elira said quietly, staring at it with an expression somewhere between awe and dread. "It's genuinely beautiful, and it might also get us all killed. I don't know how to feel about that." "Welcome to exploration," Dax said, with a tired grin that didn't quite mask how nervous he was. "Nobody said the good stuff comes easy." On the 10th day, Arbiter ran one final, exhaustive series of simulations, adjusting Elira's proposed flight path with its own 2 centuries of accumulated data about the cradle's shifting gravitational currents. The final projection gave the mission a survival probability that made Reyna's stomach drop. Not impossible, not even unlikely, but far from the comfortable certainty any reasonable captain would want before flying into the heart of a structure built to contain a civilization-ending anomaly. 61%, Arbiter reported. "I want to be honest with you about what that number means. It is the best projection 200 years of study can produce. It is not, and never will be, a guarantee." "It's better odds than the alternative," Reyna said. "The alternative is certain failure, just spread out over more years." "There is one more thing you should know before you commit to this crossing," Arbiter said, and something in its measured voice made all 3 of them go still. "The resonance seed, once activated at the cradle's core, requires an anchor consciousness to properly calibrate during the critical activation window, approximately 4 minutes during which the device essentially learns the specific pattern it needs to amplify and sustain. That anchor must be physically present, linked directly to the cradle's systems, the same way Captain Solari's crew has been linked for 2 centuries. I am obligated to tell you that this role carries the highest individual risk of the entire mission." The mess hall fell silent. Reyna already knew, with the same certainty she'd felt reading that first estate transfer notice, exactly what she was going to say. "I'll be the anchor," she said. Reyna started. "It's not up for debate," Reyna said, gently but firmly. "This is my family's ship, my family's unfinished work. I'm not asking either of you to take on a risk that belongs to me." "With respect, Captain," Dax said, "we stopped being just your crew about 9 days ago. This became ours too, the second we decided to build that thing instead of walking away." But he didn't argue further, and something in his eyes told Reyna he understood, better than most people would, why this particular choice needed to be hers. We're getting close to the heart of this story now, and if you've stayed with Reyna and her crew this far, I'd genuinely love to hear what you think happens next in the comments below. And if this kind of deep space mystery is exactly what you come here for, this is a great moment to subscribe so you don't miss whatever we uncover next. Now, back to the cradle, and to the crossing that's about to decide everything. They launched at what Arbiter designated the optimal gravitational window, the long coin's smaller frame chosen over the oaths for the crossing itself, nimbler, better suited to threading the narrow, shifting corridor of stable space that Elira's calculations had mapped through the anomaly's violent gravitational currents. Marguerite's crew remained behind aboard the Oath, still anchored in their 2-century vigil, their continued presence the only thing holding the cradle's containment stable enough for the long coin to even attempt the crossing. Reyna had said her goodbyes to Marguerite in one final linking session the night before, a conversation that had ended not with grand declarations but with something quieter and more precious. An ancestor's simple, exhausted gratitude, and a promise from Reyna that whatever happened, she would try. "That's all any of us ever really managed," Marguerite had told her. "Trying as hard and as honestly as we knew how. If you can say that much when this is over, you will have done everything I could have asked, whether the seed works or not." The crossing itself was the most harrowing flight of Reyna's career. Elira called out corrections in a voice stretched thin with concentration as the long coin bucked and shuddered through currents of warped gravity that defied every navigational instinct Reyna had built across 15 years of flying. Dax monitored the resonant seed stability from the cargo hold, reporting minor fluctuations that made Reyna's already pounding heart skip entirely more than once. And ahead of them, growing larger with every passing minute, the cradle itself finally came into direct view, a structure of impossible scale, its dark surface swallowing every scrap of light that touched it, its architecture built on proportions that made Reyna's mind ache trying to comprehend them. Vast geometric forms nested within still stranger forms, all of it arranged around a central point where reality itself seemed to visibly, subtly fray at the edges. "That's the core," Elira said, voice hushed despite the chaos of the crossing. "That's where we're going." They threaded the long coin through the cradle's outer structure along the narrow corridor of relative stability Arbiter had mapped, the ship's hull groaning under stresses it had never been designed to withstand, until finally, achingly, they broke through into a vast interior chamber at the structure's heart. What waited there defied Reyna's ability to process it as a physical space at all. The chamber seemed to exist at some uncomfortable angle to normal geometry, its walls simultaneously near and impossibly distant, and at its absolute center hung the unmaking itself, not a visible object so much as an absence, a place where Reyna's eyes simply refused to focus, where her mind slid off any attempt to comprehend what she was looking at, leaving only a deep, primal wrongness that made every instinct in her body scream to turn around. 4 minutes, Arbiter's voice crackled through the calm, relayed from the distant Oath. "Once you link and the seed begins calibration, you must hold the connection for the full duration regardless of what you experience. Disconnecting early will corrupt the calibration and could destabilize the containment further than it already is. Reyna suited up for the spacewalk with hands that only trembled a little. Dax check. King every seal twice with the meticulous care of someone who refused to let his fear show through his hands, even as his voice caught more than once. Elira held position at the long coin's controls, monitoring the ship's precarious stability against currents that seemed to actively resent its presence. "Talk to us the whole time," Dax said, voice thick. "Every second. I want to hear your voice the entire 4 minutes, you understand me?" "I understand," Reyna said, and stepped out into the vast, wrong chamber at the heart of the cradle, the resonant seed cradled carefully against her chest, tethered to her suit by a line Dax had checked and rechecked a dozen times. The seed's activation, once she reached the calibration point Arbiter had identified, a small recessed housing near the chamber's exact center, clearly built by the architects for exactly this purpose, despite the eons since anyone had used it, required Reyna to physically connect the device through a socket that fit its housing with unsettling precision, then link her own consciousness to the system through a cable running directly from her suit's neural interface. The moment the connection engaged, the wrongness of the chamber intensified into something Reyna had no framework to describe even to herself. She felt her sense of self stretching, thinning. Some part of her awareness pulled toward the vast, hungry absence at the chamber's heart, and she understood in that instant, with total visceral clarity, exactly what her ancestor and 21 crew members had willingly faced for 2 centuries to keep this thing contained. "Talk to me, Captain," Dax's voice crackled through her helmet, calm, tight with worry. "You've been quiet for 15 seconds. "I'm here," Reyna managed, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it belonged to someone else. It's trying to unravel me. I can feel it, like it's looking for the seams." "Hold on," Elira said. "Seed's showing first-stage calibration. It's working, Reyna. It's actually working." The next 3 minutes stretched into something that felt simultaneously instantaneous and endless. Reyna's entire awareness consumed by the effort of simply holding herself together against a pull that wanted, with patient, ancient hunger, to take her apart down to whatever fundamental pattern made her who she was. She thought of Marguerite's letters, of a captain 2 centuries ago choosing courage over certainty. She thought of Dax's steady hands building something impossible out of scavenged parts and stubborn hope. She thought of Elira running the same calculations over and over, refusing to let fear win even when it would have been so much easier. And somewhere in that endless, unraveling moment, she felt something shift. The seed's calibration completed with a sensation like a held breath finally releasing. The hungry pull at the chamber's center didn't vanish, but it steadied, settled, the frayed edges of reality around the unmaking drawing back into something that felt, impossibly, stable in a way the last 200 years of borrowed time never had. "Calibration complete," Arbiter's voice broke through, audibly relieved even through the artificial calm of its usual tone. "Containment stability reading at levels I have never recorded in 200 years of monitoring. Reyna, it worked. You need to disconnect now, exactly as instructed." She disconnected the seed with hands that had gone dangerously numb, the resonance device settling into its housing with a soft, final click, its surface glowing now with a steady, self-sustaining light that hadn't been there before. The walk back to the long coin felt longer than the entire crossing that had brought her there, every step through the vast wrong chamber a fight against exhaustion that went bone deep, soul deep, deeper than anything Reyna had ever experienced. Dax was waiting at the airlock, pulling her through the moment she was close enough, his hands shaking as he helped her out of her suit, checking her vitals with a desperation that told her exactly how frightened he'd been. "You did it," he said, voice breaking. "Reyna, you actually did it." Through the viewport, the cradle's dark structure had begun to change, subtle at first, then unmistakable. its impossible geometry settling into something that felt less like a wound barely held closed and more like a wound finally, properly healing. It took another 3 days for Arbiter to run full diagnostics confirming what everyone aboard both ships already suspected. The resonant seed had worked exactly as Marguerite's crew had theorized decades ago. Its self-sustaining calibration, finally strong enough to hold the cradle's containment stable, without requiring the constant cognitive presence that had bound the Oath's crew to their vigil for 2 centuries. Reyna was there in the linking chamber when Arbiter carefully, gradually began releasing the crew from their long stillness, a process that took hours rather than moments, each mind slowly, carefully reintroduced to the ordinary passage of time after 200 years suspended outside it. Dax stood at the mess hall's entrance, Elira beside him, both of them watching with held breath as, one by one, the crew of the Meridian's Oath began to stir, hands flexing after 2 centuries of stillness, eyes opening onto a galaxy that had moved on without them in every way except the ones that mattered most. And in the captain's chair on the bridge, Reyna Solari opened her eyes for the first time in 214 years, drew a slow, wondering breath, and turned to find Reyna already there, waiting, tears she'd stopped trying to hold back streaming freely down her face. "You did it," Marguerite whispered, her voice raw with disuse and overwhelming emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it," Reyna said. "All of us, you started it, we just got to finish it." Marguerite reached out with a hand that trembled from disuse, and Reyna took it, feeling the warm, undeniable reality of a connection 2 centuries in the making finally, fully realized, not through some strange link to an alien machine, but simply, humanly, family reaching for family across a gap that had once seemed impossible to close. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Reyna could have imagined when she'd first opened that estate transfer notice aboard the Long Coin. The crew of the Meridian's Oath, adjusting slowly to a galaxy 2 centuries changed from the one they remembered, found themselves grappling with a strange, bittersweet kind of homecoming. Everyone they'd known beyond the ship long since gone, the world they'd left behind transformed almost beyond recognition, and yet welcomed all of them by a bloodline that had never stopped believing they might someday need to be found. Marguerite made the decision, with her crew's full agreement, to keep the Meridian's Oath stationed near the cradle for the time being, not out of obligation any longer, since the resonant seed's self-sustaining calibration required no further human presence to maintain, but out of a fierce, hard-won attachment to the discovery that had cost them so much and finally, gloriously, paid off. They would study the architect's remaining fragments together, Marguerite decided. 2 centuries of solitary research finally opened to proper collaboration, and eventually, when they were ready, decide together what to share with the wider galaxy about a threat humanity had never known existed, and a solution that might someday help contain others like it. Reyna and her crew stayed for 3 more months, helping the Oath's crew reintegrate, sharing 2 centuries of missed history in long conversations that stretched late into every ship's night, watching old wounds slowly begin to heal in ways that had nothing to do with the cradle at all. On the day the Long Coin finally prepared to depart, Marguerite met Reyna at the docking tube, pressing something small and metal into her palm, an old brass nameplate, worn smooth by 2 centuries of careful handling, engraved simply, R-S-O-L-A-R-I. "I had this made the week we decided to stay," Marguerite admitted, a small, wry smile crossing her tired, weathered face. "I didn't know if there would ever be a Reyna Solari to claim it. I just hoped, very stubbornly, that there might be." Reyna closed her hand around the nameplate, feeling the weight of it, the weight of everything it represented. A woman who'd waited 200 years on nothing but hope, and a galaxy that had, against every reasonable expectation, finally rewarded that hope with exactly the family she'd been waiting for. "I'll come back," Reyna promised. "Not because I have to, because I want to know the rest of this story and I want to be part of writing whatever comes next." "I know you will," Marguerite said. "You're a Solari. We're stubborn about the things that matter." The long coin broke orbit from the unnamed system 3 days later, leaving the Meridian's oath standing steady vigil beside a dying star that no longer posed the threat it once had. Its ancient family reunited, its long-borrowed time finally, properly repaid. Reyna sat in the cockpit as the red giant shrank behind them, Dax and Elira quiet beside her, all three of them carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that comes only from having given everything to something that mattered and finding, against every reasonable expectation, that it had actually been enough. She thought about the estate transfer notice that had started it all, the strange gift of an inheritance that had turned out to be nothing like money or property. A chance to finish what an ancestor had begun. A chance to discover exactly how far courage could carry ordinary people when the alternative was simply walking away from something too important to abandon. Out beyond the mapped edges of every chart humanity had ever drawn, Reyna understood now. The galaxy was still full of impossible things waiting to be found. Ancient dangers held at bay by forgotten guardians, unfinished stories left hanging across centuries, and families, sometimes, who never stopped waiting for someone to come looking. She didn't know yet what the architect's remaining fragments would eventually reveal, or whether other cradles existed elsewhere in the galaxy's forgotten corners, silently containing dangers nobody else yet knew to fear. She didn't know what other unmapped coordinates might someday arrive in some distant descendant's inbox, carrying secrets 2 centuries deep and choices every bit as impossible as the one she'd just faced. But she knew, watching the dying star finally fade from the long coin's rear viewport, that whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone, and that somewhere out among all those uncharted stars, hope had a way of waiting patiently for exactly as long as it needed to, until finally, impossibly, someone came home to answer it. The galaxy, Reyna thought, still held more secrets than any single lifetime could ever hope to uncover. And for the first time since she'd opened that strange, impossible message in the middle of the night, she found herself genuinely, fiercely grateful for every single one still waiting to be found.